In this video, I'd like to discuss the opening stanza of Shelley's poem Ode to the West Wind. And this particular stanza starts with a literary device that we refer to as an apostrophe. So this is not the punctuation device. An apostrophe is basically an address to either an absent person or an inanimate object. Think of Hamlet talking to a skull, for instance. In this case, the object is the west wind. So, O wild west wind, thou breath of autumn's being. And it's interesting that it takes Shelley a long time to actually say something to the west wind while he's saying all of this, but to really address it fully. And as we go through the poem, he says, thou, and then later, O thou, and then at the very end, he finally says, hear, O hear. So the apostrophe kind of concludes there, although in subsequent stanzas he'll pick this up again. And the idea here is that he's saying to the west wind, please listen to me, right? You need to inspire me. You need to affect me in some way. It's rather interesting then that the whole first stanza is almost one sentence, basically. It's one elaborate, difficult sentence. And by grammatical standards, maybe it's not entirely correct, but who cares? It's poetry. So this apostrophe has actually led to a lot of discussion. And I'll give you a couple of quotations here from people who have talked about the apostrophe. The first one is from Gavin Hobbes. So Hobbes writes the following: in Shelley's ode, the proliferation of subordinate constructions, right, all these different clauses that kind of add up together, staves off the invoking verb. And the invoking verb here is hear. So you're invoking something, you're calling to somebody, which in the end turns out to ask only for what the act of calling always implicitly asks, for 105 words, or the whole of the poem's first sonnet stanza. This astonishing vocative water treading, that's quite the mouthful itself, but basically we're kind of just waiting around until we can finish this vocative invocation or calling on somebody, which advertises its own gratuity. In other words, it's kind of over the top and somewhat needless, might be described as the stammering of excessive asking. Rather than reticently backing away from calling, right, kind of shyly saying, well, I guess you don't need to listen to me, or having its calling sundered by a sense of its inefficacy. In other words, I'm just going to stop calling, I'll break with this because it's pointless. Shelley's invocation only and insistently calls. Indeed, it calls too much, and thus, as it were, overtakes its aim, and is in a sense turned towards itself, since it seems to yearn above all to keep itself in being. That's a lot to say about the apostrophe, but it does point something out, which is that most of us, if we're going to go out into nature, we're not really going to talk out loud, right? We're not going to say, hey, west wind, please listen to me. Something ludicrous about this. So the very fact that the poet does this points out a certain artificial aspect to this kind of calling. And I think that's important because it right away gives you the sense that Shelley is willing to do something that seems maybe a little bit unnatural, but that is extremely dramatic. It draws attention to itself as a kind of dramatic act. Another critic, Jonathan Culler, a really prominent critic, has also talked about the apostrophe, and in relation to another poem, a poem addressed to Aphrodite, he says the following: the hyperbolic or extravagant character of this invocation of the other makes the poem not the fictional representation of an experience or an event, so much as an attempt to be itself an event. In other words, when you get this kind of apostrophe, Shelley is not saying, hey, I'm going to describe myself or somebody else calling out to the wind. Instead, I'm going to describe an event itself, and that's the event of calling. This is the event. You're witnessing it, and when you read it aloud, you reenact the event. All right, that's a lot to say about the opening few words here. Now, as we go on, it says, O wild west wind, so you can hear the alliteration there, right? O wild west wind, thou breath of autumn's being. And there's something kind of paradoxical about this notion that being, which we think of as somewhat substantial typically, is indicated by a breath. Although we should probably remember that if we think of the Bible, right, it's the breath of God It's this notion that life is breathed into us. So the breath is also the soul, the spirit. And the fall, autumn, its soul, its spiritual life in a sense, is created by the energy and the movement of the west wind. As we go on here, Shelley writes, "Thou, from whose unseen presence the leaves dead are driven like ghosts from an enchanter fleeing." So the west wind is like an enchanter casting spells, driving the leaves falling from the trees ahead of itself. A beautiful image here. And notice this interesting phrase, unseen presence, right? That sounds kind of paradoxical as well. And in fact, there's a lot of these kind of binary oppositions in the text. So we have life and death, being, nothingness, I, thou, preservation, destruction, west, east, spring, fall, seen and unseen, and so on and so forth. And we'll come back to another one later. And if you want to read more about this, I suggest you read the critic Eric Powell, who's done some really good work on this and who provides this list as well. Okay, so unseen presence then. We have something that's unseen and yet it somehow is present. Then it says, "The leaves dead are driven like ghosts from an enchanter fleeing." And I just want to return to this word thou for a moment here. So thou is something that the critic Harold Bloom has talked about a lot, and he points to the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber. So Martin Buber, who made an important distinction between two pronouns. He refers to these as it and thou. Okay. Now, he argued in the early 20th century that sometimes we treat the world as just an it, or objects in the world are just an it. They're kind of dead, they're not animated, they're not full of life. But if we change our perspective and treat it as a thou, all of a sudden we have a sense of wonder, and we have a sense of curiosity and admiration and respect and things like this. And of course, we can also apply these pronouns to people, so that if we treat them as a thou instead of an it, we are going to respect their dignity and so forth. Okay, so it's a really interesting concept, and Harold Bloom has argued that in this poem, the thou also gives us a sense then of nature as not just being a series of objects, but as having something divine behind it. Not the Christian God, as we said in our first video, but something spiritual, something awesome, something that we should respect, and that really is what Shelley is trying to capture. And that thou, as Bloom points out, goes well beyond the actual wind, right? Something that extends even beyond that. Now, as we go on here then, the imagery in this part of the poem is quite apocalyptic. So think of these colors, yellow and black and pale and hectic red. Kind of reminds you of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, perhaps. And this adjective hectic is interesting too, because in the past, a hectic fever referred to tuberculosis or consumption. So it has to do with disease. Similarly, we have a reference to pestilence, so plague-stricken multitudes, you could say. And if you look at leaves in the fall, sometimes they do have these little spots on them and disfigurations and scars and all of that. So it's a really impressive image here. And then what Shelley adds to it is also the sense of personification, right? They are multitudes. There's many of them. And they are like ghosts, as if they are driven in front of this enchanter. The west wind then charioteth to their dark wintry bed the winged seeds. And when you think of these winged seeds, you should think of these little helicopters that you see in the fall as they fall to the ground. They're very pretty, right? They're kind of neat to see. And the image here is something that reminds us perhaps of epic poetry. So in epic poetry, the heroes often are in a chariot. They throw their spears at the enemy. Think of Homer. And a lot of these heroes, they typically have descriptions that make them seem kind of epic. So if you think of these descriptions, they're called epithets. Epithets. And we have, for instance, wily Odysseus. Okay, or we have Zeus, cloud gatherer. Those are just a couple of examples. So this part, cloud gatherer or wily, this is an epithet. And in this particular description, we have winged seeds, right? It sounds more epic in a sense, and it goes really well with the sense of charioting, which is an unusual verb, as if you're driving your chariot, just like before we have driven. And the west wind is doing this epic action. And by the way, the chariot is also a divine vehicle. If you read the Bible, Ezekiel 1 is a good passage to look at. All right, so we have a pretty good sense then of what the west wind does. It drives the seeds into the ground and they lie there buried, but then the poem suddenly shifts gears and all of a sudden it starts talking about spring. So in this part of the poem, we get this radical contrast. And this is important because the whole poem is constructed out of these contrasts, or binaries, as we said before. So in the spring then, the other wind, right, which is Zephyrus, is going to blow very sweetly, and it's going to blow its clarion, which is a kind of trumpet. And the trumpet here is still a bit warlike, I would say. It's often used in war, but very quickly the imagery will change and become much more peaceful. Even this color azure, a kind of beautiful blue, suggests something more peaceful, and azure is one of Shelley's favorite colors. So these seeds then are lying in their graves in the soil until the spring is going to blow, and then the action of the wind in the spring will make the flowers grow again, the seeds will come up, and everything will come back to life. So if you skip this bit in parentheses here, you can basically read from here to there, and it says, the spring will fill with living hues, right, living colors, and odors, smells, plain and hill. Everything will be alive. In the middle, we have this image of driving again. So we had driven before, and here we have a repetition of this idea. But in this case, the image is not of ghosts being driven, but of sheep being driven. So in this case, we're dealing with a much more pastoral image here. So pastoral poetry deals with shepherds and sheep and playing the flute and things like that. And maybe that's why it's in parentheses here as well. This very peaceful image seems to be kind of tucked away. So it says, driving sweet buds like flocks to feed in air. These buds are the little buds on the flowers. They need to open up. And what they need to feed on is air. But flocks, of course, flocks of sheep need grass. So it's an interesting comparison here. It's as if the shepherd, the west wind, which in this case is Zephyrus, the spring wind, drives these sweet buds like sheep to get the oxygen that they need, and then they grow. All right, and that brings us then to the end here, which is the final couplet. Wild spirits which are moving everywhere, destroyer and preserver, hear, oh hear. These terms here, destroyer and preserver, may be a reference to Hinduism, which has a kind of trinity of gods, and two of them are mentioned here. So the destroyer typically is Shiva. Okay, there we go, Shiva. And then the preserver is Vishnu. Vishnu. That's an N here. There you go. There's one more figure, which is Brahma, the creator, which is not mentioned here. But I think Shelley is kind of borrowing these ideas, and he's suggesting that both of these actions of destroying and preserving are present here. Now, the last thing I'd like to touch on is the fact that there's one more binary that we haven't discussed yet, and this is the difference between necessity and contingency. And it's a distinction that Eric Powell brings up in his work, and I really like this idea. So if we think of necessity, okay, so necessity, there we go. Necessity means that things run according to a certain order, a certain plan. And you can think of this in relation to natural cycles. So natural cycles, in other words, there's spring, there is summer, there's fall, there's winter, right? There's a sort of order to nature. And by contrast, contingency, so contingency, This has to do more with random events. Random events. Think of something like an earthquake all of a sudden. Nature then can sometimes seem very orderly and at other times kind of random. And of course, some of these categories are arbitrary in themselves. But, as Powell has pointed out, we should also relate these things to politics, because Shelley, as the poem goes on, will be very political. He wants his poetry to inspire people and to create political change. But how does political change happen? This was a question that really made Shelley think, because he wanted reform, but is it better to wait and allow for a kind of gradual reform, right? Kind of like a natural cycle. If you think that things will improve, then eventually, if you just wait long enough, there will be gradual reform of political institutions, laws will be changed. And so politics can be compared to a kind of natural evolution, perhaps. On the other hand, if you want to have a revolt, a random event, some kind of, dramatic revolutionary activity, maybe that's more like contingency. Out of the blue, all of a sudden we have this dramatic event. And the west wind, in a sense, captures this contrast, because on the one hand, the west wind is part of a natural series of cycles. It's predictable in its own way, and yet we have this adjective wild, right? So wild, and at the end as well, wild spirit, which suggests something more contingent. Okay, so hopefully that helps you a little bit with understanding the first stanza, and in the next video we'll talk about the second one.